She had nothing left, no husband, no money, no pride, just two hungry children and scraps from a saloon's garbage. The whole town watched her fall, whispered behind her back, waited for her to disappear. But Eliza Hart refused to die in silence. Then he appeared, a stranger with cold eyes and an impossible offer. Come home with me. Was he her salvation or her final mistake? If you want to follow Eliza's journey from rags to redemption, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The Wyoming sun hung merciless in the pale August sky, bleaching the wooden storefronts of Bitter Creek until they looked like bones scattered across the prairie. Heat shimmered above the dusty main street in waves that made the distant mountains dance and blur, and not a single soul moved through the afternoon stillness except the flies that gathered in black clouds around the horse troughs. Behind the Lucky Dollar Saloon, where the shade offered the only mercy to be found, a woman crouched with her back pressed against the weathered planks. Her name was Eliza Hart, though she had stopped thinking of herself by any name at all. Names belonged to people with futures, with addresses, with reasons to introduce themselves. She was simply the widow now, the one with the children, the one who used to have a farm, the one whose husband had been fool enough to die and leave her with nothing but debt and two small mouths that never stopped kneading. "Mama," her daughter Lily whispered, her voice thin as paper. "Is it safe?" Eliza peered around the corner of the building, scanning the alley for movement. The kitchen door remained closed. She could hear pots clanging inside, the cook cursing at someone about burned biscuits, the familiar chaos of a lunch rush ending. In perhaps 10 minutes, maybe less, someone would emerge with the scraps, the burned edges of roast beef, the bread too stale to serve, the vegetables that had wilted beyond presentation. It would go to the pigs if she didn't get to it first. "Stay quiet," Eliza murmured, pulling her daughter closer. "Just a little longer." Her son Thomas sat with his knees drawn to his chest, his 8-year-old face wearing an expression no child should know how to make. He understood too much, that boy. He understood that they were hiding. He understood that his mother, who had once hosted Sunday dinners and worn dresses with lace collars, now competed with animals for food. He understood, and he said nothing, and somehow his silence was worse than any accusation. The kitchen door banged open. Eliza pressed herself flat against the wall, one hand on each child, holding them still with a grip that had grown expert over months of practice. Through the gap between boards, she watched a heavy-set man in a stained apron emerge carrying a bucket that sloshed with promise. He walked to the edge of the alley where the pig trough sat waiting, and he dumped the contents with the careless efficiency of routine. Then he went back inside. Eliza counted to 20, slowly, carefully, fighting the hunger that screamed at her to move faster. She had learned patience. She had learned that desperation could wait 10 seconds more if it meant avoiding the shame of being seen. She had learned so many things in the 6 months since Daniel died, lessons that no woman should ever have to know. "Now," she whispered. They moved together, the three of them, crossing the 10 feet of open ground like shadows afraid of light. Eliza reached the trough first, her hands plunging into the warm slop before she could let herself think about what she was doing. Bread. There. Meat. Mostly gristle, but meat nonetheless. A potato that had gone soft but was not yet rotten. She gathered these treasures into her apron with movements made swift by practice, then divided them between her children with the mathematical precision of a mother who knew exactly how much food a growing body needed and exactly how far short she was falling. "Eat slowly," she reminded them, though the words felt hollow. How could she tell them to savor what shame provided? Thomas bit into a piece of bread that had turned the color of old leather, chewing with determined concentration. Beside him, Lily picked at a strip of beef, her small fingers separating the edible portions from the waste, with a discrimination that broke Eliza's heart. Her daughter was 6 years old. 6 years old, and she already knew the difference between hungry and starving, between pride and survival. "This is good, Mama," Lily said softly, and the gratitude in her voice was a knife between Eliza's ribs. She turned away so her children wouldn't see the tears she could no longer hold back. Crying was a luxury, she reminded herself. Crying didn't fill bellies or find shelter or make tomorrow any easier than today. But sometimes, in moments like this, crouched in the dirt behind a saloon while her babies ate garbage, Sometimes the tears came whether she wanted them or not. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and forced herself to focus on practical matters. They would need to find somewhere to sleep tonight. The abandoned barn at the edge of town had been their refuge for the past week, but yesterday the owner had discovered them and made his feelings clear with a shotgun in language that still burned in her ears. The church sometimes let travelers rest in the back pews, but the church ladies had made it known that Eliza Hart was not welcome among decent folk. Something about her husband's debts, about the way she had let the farm fail, about the impropriety of a woman alone with children and no ring that meant anything anymore. "Well, well," a voice drawled from somewhere above her. "Look what we have here." Eliza's blood went cold. She rose slowly, positioning herself between the voice and her children, though she knew the gesture was meaningless. She had no weapons, no strength, no allies. She had only the stubborn refusal to die quietly that had kept her alive this long. 3 men stood at the mouth of the alley, their faces shadowed by hat brims that couldn't hide their smirks. She recognized them, Carter Mills and his brothers, ranchers who thought their money gave them permission to treat the town like their personal property. Carter had made comments to her before, suggestions wrapped in smiles that made her skin crawl. She had ignored him then. She had been able to afford the luxury of ignoring him then. "Mrs. Hart," Carter said, taking a step closer. "I've been looking for you. I have nothing you want." Now that's not true at all. His gaze traveled over her in a way that made her want to scrub herself raw. A pretty widow, all alone in the world, no one to look after her interests. "I'd say you have plenty I want." Thomas stood up, his small hands balling into fists. "Leave my mama alone." Carter laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that bounced off the alley walls. "The boy has spirit. That's good. He'll need it." "Please." Eliza hated the word as it left her mouth, hated the crack in her voice, hated everything about this moment. "We're not bothering anyone. We'll be gone in an hour. I promise." "Gone where?" Carter spread his hands as if asking a reasonable question. "The church won't have you. The hotel certainly won't. I've heard the Women's Society has put out word that no respectable household should offer you work." He clicked his tongue in mock sympathy. "It's a hard world for a woman alone, Mrs. Hart. A very hard world indeed." He was close enough now that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, the tobacco in his clothes. His brothers had spread out behind him, blocking any escape route, trapping her against the weathered boards of the saloon. "But I'm a reasonable man," Carter continued, "and I've got a big house with plenty of room. All you'd have to do is keep me company, keep the house clean, keep my bed warm." He smiled, showing teeth that had gone yellow from years of neglect. "It wouldn't be so bad. Better than eating pig slop, anyway." Eliza's stomach heaved. "I'd rather starve." "Would you?" Carter's smile vanished, replaced by something cold and patient. "Would your children rather starve too?" She didn't answer, couldn't answer. The question lodged in her throat like a stone, choking off any response she might have formed. Because the terrible truth, the truth she would never speak aloud, not even in her darkest moments, was that she didn't know anymore. She didn't know where the line was, didn't know how much further she could fall before she lost herself entirely. She had already lost so much: her home, her husband, her dignity. What was left to protect except her children? And if protecting her children meant, "That's enough," the voice came from behind the Mills brothers, quiet and flat as a prairie sky before a storm. All 3 men turned, and in the space their movement created, Eliza saw the speaker. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that might have been carved from the same stone as the mountains visible beyond the town. He wore the clothes of a working rancher, faded and practical, and he stood with his feet planted like a man who had no intention of moving for anyone. "Who the hell are you?" Carter demanded. "Caleb Rowan." Something shifted in the alley, some invisible current that made the Mills brothers exchange uncertain glances. Eliza had heard the name before. Rowan, the rancher who lived alone at the far edge of the valley, the one who came to town only when absolutely necessary and spoke to no one when he did. There were stories about him, whispered over afternoon tea and church socials. Stories about a dead wife, a lost child, a man who had buried his heart somewhere in the high country and never gone back for it. The Rowan place is 10 miles east of here, Carter said, recovering his composure. Long way to ride for business that doesn't concern you. Everything that happens in this town concerns me. Caleb Rowan's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It simply existed, as immovable as the rest of him, including men who corner women in alleys. This is a private conversation. Not anymore. The silence stretched between them, taut as a rope about to snap. Eliza pressed her children against her legs, watching the standoff with breath held and heart pounding. She knew how these things usually ended. Men like Carter Mills didn't back down in public, didn't allow themselves to be embarrassed in front of an audience. And men like Caleb Rowan, men who spoke with that kind of quiet certainty, usually knew it. But Carter surprisingly laughed. "Fine," he said, stepping back with exaggerated courtesy. "Fine. Keep your trash, Rowan. She's not worth the trouble anyway." He tipped his hat to Eliza, the gesture somehow more insulting than anything else he'd done. "Think about my offer, Mrs. Hart. It won't last forever." Then he was gone, his brothers trailing behind him, their bootsteps fading into the afternoon heat until the alley held only silence. Eliza sagged against the wall, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Thomas and Lily clung to her skirt, their small faces pale with a fear they were too young to fully understand. "Thank you," she managed, though the words felt insufficient. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "I do." She looked up at that, met Caleb Rowan's eyes for the first time. They were gray, not the soft gray of morning fog, but the hard gray of winter ice on a frozen river, eyes that had seen things and stopped flinching from them long ago. "You should get your children out of this alley," he said. "It's not safe." A laugh escaped her before she could stop it, high and broken and completely without humor. "Nothing is safe, Mr. Rowan. That's the lesson I've learned these past months. There is no safety. There is no shelter. There is only the choice between one danger and another." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze dropped to the children still pressed against her sides, to Thomas's too thin arms and Lily's hollowed cheeks and the way they both shook despite the August heat. Something changed in his face, something that might have been recognition or memory or pain. "Where are you staying?" "Nowhere." She saw no point in lying. "We were sleeping in the Hendricks barn, but they found us yesterday. Tonight—" She shrugged, the gesture conveying everything words couldn't express. "Tonight we'll find somewhere else." "The children need food." "I'm aware of that, Mr. Rowan." The edge in her voice surprised her. She had thought all her edges worn smooth by desperation. "I'm doing the best I can." "Pig slop?" Heat flooded her cheeks. "At least it's something." Another long silence, during which Eliza became acutely aware of how she must look to him. Her dress stained and torn, her hair escaping from a bun that had been repinned so many times it no longer held any shape, her hands red and rough from washing other people's laundry for pennies when anyone would hire her at all. "How long has it been?" Caleb asked. "Since you ate?" The question caught her off guard. I don't— Mama ate yesterday," Thomas said quietly, "but only a little bit. She gave the rest to us." Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment something flickered in those winter-gray eyes, something hot and angry that made Eliza want to step back. But then it was gone, buried behind that impenetrable calm. "Get your things," he said. Eliza blinked. "What?" "Whatever you own, whatever you've saved, get it, now." "Mr. Rowan, I don't understand. You're coming with me." She stared at him, certain she had misheard. The words made no sense, could make no sense. She was a stranger to him, a destitute widow with nothing to offer anyone, a burden that even her own husband's family had refused to carry. Why would a man like Caleb Rowan, a man who by all accounts wanted nothing to do with any living soul, suddenly invite her to go anywhere? "I can't," she said, though the refusal felt hollow even as she spoke it. "I don't know you. You don't know me. People would talk. People are already talking about you eating garbage and sleeping in barns and being propositioned by men like Carter Mills." His voice remained flat, factual, utterly devoid of judgment. "What more damage can a little more talk do?" Why would you do this? The question burst out of her, stripped of pride and caution. What do you want from me? For the first time, something like emotion crossed Caleb Rowan's face, a shadow that might have been grief or might have been something older, something deeper. I want nothing from you, Mrs. Hart. I have a ranch that needs work. I can't do alone. I have a house with empty rooms that serve no purpose. I have more food than one man can eat and more firewood than one man can burn. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough in a way it hadn't been before. What I want is for those children to stop looking at me like they're afraid I'm going to hurt them. Eliza turned to look at her children, really look at them, and saw what he must see. Thomas standing rigid as a soldier, his jaw set against tears he was too proud to shed. Lily half hidden behind her brother, her grip on Eliza's skirt white-knuckled with terror. They had learned to be afraid of everything, of strangers, of sounds in the night, of the gnawing hunger that had become their constant companion. They had learned lessons that would take years to unlearn, if they ever could at all. I don't trust you, she said quietly. I wouldn't expect you to. I don't understand your motives. You don't need to. This could be worse than staying here. You could be worse than Carter Mills. At that, Caleb's expression shifted, the smallest crack in the stone facade. I could be. You'll have to decide for yourself whether I am. She looked at him, at this stranger who had appeared from nowhere with an offer that sounded like salvation and might be anything but. She looked at her children, at their hollow cheeks and hungry eyes. She looked at the alley around them, at the pig trough, and the scraps still clinging to her apron, and the life that had somehow become her only option. Mama, Thomas tugged at her sleeve, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm still hungry. 3 words. 3 small, devastating words that shattered whatever resistance she had left. Because the truth was simple and terrible. She couldn't feed her children. She couldn't shelter them, couldn't protect them, couldn't give them any of the things a mother was supposed to provide. She had tried everything, worked until her hands bled, begged until her pride was nothing but a memory, fought until she had nothing left to fight with. And still it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. All right, she heard herself say. The words felt like surrender, tasted like ash. All right, Mr. Rowan, we'll come with you. He nodded once, as if he had expected nothing else. Where are your things? Behind the church. There's a spot under the stairs where I hid what we have left. Get them. I'll bring the wagon around front. Then he was gone, striding out of the alley with the same deliberate purpose that seemed to characterize everything he did. Eliza watched him go, feeling oddly unmoored, as if she had stepped off a cliff and was waiting to see whether she would fall or fly. Mama? Lily's voice trembled. Are we really going with that man? Eliza knelt down and gathered both children into her arms, holding them close enough to feel their hearts beating against her own. They smelled of dust and sweat and the lingering scent of the food they had scavenged, her beautiful children, reduced to creatures of survival. Yes, she said, though she wasn't sure if she was answering her daughter or convincing herself. Yes, we're going with him. Is he a bad man? I don't know, sweetheart. I truly don't know. Then why? Because sometimes, Eliza said quietly, you have to choose between the fear you know and the fear you don't. And right now, the fear I know is killing us. Thomas pulled back to look at her, his eyes too old, too knowing. I'll protect you, Mama. If he tries anything, I know you will. She smoothed the hair back from his forehead, marveling at the fierce determination in his young face. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. The wagon waited at the end of Main Street, plain and practical, pulled by 2 horses that looked as solid and unremarkable as their owner. Eliza climbed up onto the seat with her children, the bundle of their remaining possessions clutched in her lap like a talisman. 3 dresses, 2 for her and 1 for Lily. 2 shirts for Thomas, both wearing thin at the elbows. A hairbrush that had belonged to her mother, Daniel's Bible, though she hadn't been able to bring herself to open it since his funeral. These were the remnants of her former life, the evidence that she had once been someone with a home and a future. Caleb said nothing as he took up the reins. The wagon lurched forward, carrying them past the storefronts and the saloon and the church, where the Women's Society gathered to pray for the less fortunate, as long as the less fortunate stayed conveniently out of sight. People stared, Eliza felt their gazes like physical weight, the curiosity and judgment and gleeful anticipation of gossip. She saw Mrs. Henderson pause mid-stride on the wooden walkway, her mouth falling open in shock. She saw the banker's wife elbow her companion and whisper something that made them both cover their smiles with gloved hands. She saw Carter Mills standing in the doorway of the general store, his expression cold with thwarted plans. Let them look, she thought with a defiance that surprised her. Let them talk. What more can they take from me? The town fell away behind them, replaced by open prairie that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The road, if it could be called that, wound between clumps of sagebrush and over gentle rises, and with each mile that passed, Eliza felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, more like the absence of constant threat, the unfamiliar sensation of not waiting for the next blow to fall. "The ranch is about 2 hours out," Caleb said after perhaps half an hour of silence. "There's water in the canteen under the seat. Make sure the children drink." Eliza found the canteen and passed it to Thomas, watching as he took careful sips before handing it to his sister. Even now, even with water freely offered, they rationed themselves automatically. The habit of scarcity had written itself into their bones. "Mr. Rowan," she began, then hesitated. "What did you say to a stranger who had rescued you from one fate only to deliver you to another?" "Thank you for what you did back there, for stopping those men." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "There's no need for thanks." "There is. Most people in that town wouldn't have interfered. Most people in that town have been watching us starve for months and doing nothing. Then most people in that town are fools." The flatness of his voice made the words strike harder somehow. Not anger, not judgment, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same matter-of-fact certainty as everything else he said. "Why did you come to town today?" she asked. "You said yourself it's 10 miles. That's a long way to ride." "Supplies. I try to make the trip once a month, less if I can manage." "And you just happened to be in that alley at exactly that moment?" For the first time, something like discomfort flickered across his features. "I was coming around from the feed store. I heard the boy." Thomas. She had almost forgotten, Thomas trying to defend her with his small fists and his desperate courage. "He's got a strong voice," Caleb continued. "Carries. He's protective. Ever since his father died, he's tried to be the man of the family." Eliza's throat tightened. "He's 8 years old. He shouldn't have to be anything except a child." "No," Caleb agreed. "He shouldn't." They fell silent again, but this time it felt less oppressive, less like a wall and more like a rest between conversations. Eliza watched the landscape scroll past, so different from the green hills of Tennessee where she had grown up. Wyoming was vast and harsh and unforgiving, a place that stripped away everything soft and left only what was strong enough to survive. Maybe that was why she was still here. Maybe she was stronger than she knew. "What will people say?" she asked eventually. "About this arrangement?" "Probably nothing worth hearing." "That's not an answer." Caleb sighed, a sound of genuine weariness. "They'll say whatever they want to say. They'll assume the worst because that's what people do. They'll talk about how the lonely rancher took in the desperate widow and imagine all sorts of sordid details." He glanced at her sideways, his gray eyes unreadable. "Does it matter?" "It might matter to you." "I stopped caring what people think a long time ago. Mrs. Hart, you should try it sometime." There was something in his voice, a depth of bitterness, of old wounds poorly healed, that made her want to ask more. But they were still strangers, still feeling their way through the unfamiliar territory of forced proximity, and she knew better than to push. "What about your family?" she asked instead. "Won't they object to having strangers in your home?" The muscles in his jaw tightened. "I don't have family." "I'm sorry, I thought people said you had a wife." "Had." The single word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward into silence. Eliza looked at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw and the way his hands gripped the reins, and understood that she had stumbled onto sacred ground. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have asked." He didn't respond. The rest of the journey passed in that strange, suspended quiet, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the occasional question from one of the children. Thomas wanted to know how far the ranch was. Lily wanted to know if there would be food. Both questions Eliza couldn't answer, so she made promises she hoped she could keep and prayed she hadn't just traded one form of desperation for another. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains when the Rowan Ranch finally came into view. It was larger than she had expected, a main house built of sturdy logs, weathered to silver gray by years of sun and wind, a barn that looked newly repaired, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden gone slightly wild, a corral where two horses stood watching their approach with mild interest. Everything about the place spoke of hard work and careful maintenance, of a man who took pride in what he had built. "This is your home," Eliza breathed, and couldn't quite keep the wonder from her voice. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "It was," he said. "It will be again." She didn't know what to make of that, so she said nothing as he helped her down from the wagon seat. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of a man who worked every day of his life, and they touched her with surprising gentleness. "There are 3 bedrooms upstairs," he said. "You and the children can take the 2 at the end of the hall. The kitchen is stocked, not fancy, but filling. The pump works, there's wood for the stove, and the privy is around back." He was talking too fast, Eliza realized, filling the silence with practical information because he didn't know what else to say. It was such a human reaction, so unexpected from someone who had seemed carved from granite, that she almost smiled. "What about you?" she asked. "Where will you sleep?" "There's a room in the barn I've been using. It's comfortable enough." "Mr. Rowan, I can't ask you to leave your own house. You're not asking. I'm offering." He turned toward the barn, then stopped. "There's one thing I should tell you, Mrs. Hart." She braced herself, waiting for the catch, the condition, the price she should have known was coming all along. "I don't expect anything from you," he said quietly. "Not housework, not cooking, not anything else. You're not my servant, and you're not my prisoner. The door is always unlocked. If you decide to leave tomorrow, or next week, or a month from now, I won't stop you." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough. "I just couldn't watch those children starve. That's all this is." Then he walked away, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step, and left Eliza standing in the fading light with her children pressed against her sides, and a feeling in her chest she couldn't quite name. "Mama?" Lily tugged at her sleeve. "Can we go inside?" Eliza looked at the house, at its solid walls and intact roof and windows that actually had glass in them. She thought about the months of sleeping in barns and alleys, and once, on a particularly terrible night, under a bridge while rain poured down around them. She thought about hunger and shame and the constant gnawing fear that had been her companion since Daniel's death. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears burning behind her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. Let's go inside." The door opened easily under her touch, revealing a main room that was simple but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now but laid with wood ready for lighting. A rough-hewn table sat before it with 4 chairs. 4, she noted, as if he had always planned for company he never had. The kitchen was to the right, visible through an open doorway, and she could see shelves lined with preserved vegetables and a basket of eggs on the counter. Eggs. Real eggs. She couldn't remember the last time her children had eaten eggs. "I'm going to make you breakfast for dinner," she announced, surprising herself with the decision. "Both of you go wash your hands at the pump. Now." The children scurried off, and Eliza found herself alone in a stranger's house, surrounded by evidence of a life she didn't understand. There were no photographs on the walls, no decorations of any kind, just the sparse furnishings of a man who had stopped caring about anything beyond basic function. But everything was well made and well maintained, the work of hands that knew their craft. She moved to the kitchen, familiarizing herself with the space. The stove was a good one, cast iron that would hold heat well. The pantry held flour and sugar and coffee and a dozen other staples she hadn't been able to afford for months. There was even a small jar of honey, golden and thick, the kind of luxury she had almost forgotten existed. By the time the children came back, she had eggs frying in a pan and coffee brewing on the stove. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and ordinary, and somehow more wonderful than anything she could remember. "Sit," she told them, gesturing to the table. "Eat." They didn't need to be told twice. Thomas fell on his food with the controlled desperation of someone who had learned not to waste a single bite, while Lily ate more slowly, savoring each mouthful as if afraid it might disappear. Eliza watched them, her own plate untouched, and felt something break open inside her chest. Not sadness, exactly. Or not only sadness, something more complicated. A mixture of grief for what they had lost, and gratitude for what they had found, and fear of what might still be coming. "Mama, aren't you going to eat?" Thomas asked, pausing with his fork halfway to his mouth. She picked up her own fork, more to reassure him than because she had any appetite. "Of course, sweetheart. I was just thinking." "About what?" "About everything. About nothing. About a stranger with winter-gray eyes who had pulled her from the gutter without asking for anything in return. About the uncertain future stretching before them, full of possibilities both wonderful and terrible." "About how good these eggs are," she said finally. "Now finish yours before they get cold." Later, after the children had been fed and bathed and tucked into beds that were softer than anything they had slept on in months, Eliza stood at the window of the room Caleb had designated as hers and looked out at the Wyoming night. The stars were incredible, brighter and more numerous than she had ever seen them in Tennessee, scattered across the black velvet sky like diamonds spilled from a careless hand. The mountains rose dark against the horizon, and somewhere out there, in the barn she could barely see in the darkness, a man who was still mostly a stranger had given up his bed so that she could have a roof over her head. She didn't understand him, didn't understand his motives or his silences or the grief that seemed to hang around him like a second shadow. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know if this sanctuary would last or if it would crumble like everything else she had tried to hold on to. But for tonight, just for tonight, her children were safe and fed and sleeping in real beds. For tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow she would worry about everything else. Tomorrow she would begin the impossible task of rebuilding a life from ashes. But tonight, Eliza Hart allowed herself something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. It was small and fragile and easily broken. She knew that better than anyone. But it was there, flickering in her chest like a candle flame in a dark room. And for the first time since Daniel's death, she thought maybe, just maybe, she might survive. The first morning at the Rowan Ranch came soft and golden, sunlight spilling through the window in warm ribbons that fell across Eliza's face and pulled her gently from sleep. For a long, disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed beneath her was too soft, the sheets too clean, the silence too complete. Then memory returned in a rush, the alley, the stranger, the impossible offer, and she sat up with her heart pounding against her ribs. The children. She threw off the covers and crossed to the room next door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. But when she eased open the door, the panic drained from her body like water from a cracked vessel. Thomas and Lily lay tangled together in the center of the bed, their faces slack with the deep, untroubled sleep of children who had finally found safety. Lily's thumb had found its way to her mouth, a habit Eliza had thought broken months ago. Thomas had one arm thrown protectively over his sister, guardian even in dreams. Eliza stood in the doorway and watched them breathe and felt something crack open in her chest that she had kept sealed tight for 6 months. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. Not tears of sadness, not this time, but something rawer and more complicated. Relief, perhaps, or the beginning of it. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and made herself move. There was work to be done, routines to establish, a debt to begin repaying even if the man who had created it claimed he wanted nothing in return. She dressed quickly in the cleanest of her 2 dresses, the blue one, faded but decent, and twisted her hair into something approaching respectability. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror above the washstand was gaunt and tired, older than its 28 years, but there was something in the eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. Hope, she thought again, and the word felt less fragile this time. The house was quiet as she descended the stairs, but when she entered the kitchen, she found evidence that Caleb had already been there. A fresh bucket of water sat beside the pump. The stove had been lit, its warmth beginning to chase the morning chill from the room. And on the table, placed with careful precision, was a note written in a hand that was bold and slightly uneven, as if the writer was more accustomed to gripping reins than pens. Eggs in the coop, milk in the spring house, I'll be in the north pasture until midday. Help yourself to anything you need. No signature, no further explanation, just practical information delivered with the same matter-of-fact efficiency that seemed to characterize everything about Caleb Rowan. Eliza read the note twice, then folded it and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't know why she kept it. A reminder, perhaps, that this was real. That yesterday had actually happened. That she hadn't imagined a stranger's unexpected mercy. She found the eggs where he had promised, warm from the hens that clucked and fussed as she gathered them. The milk was in the spring house too, cool and fresh in a ceramic jug that sweated in the morning air. She carried both back to the kitchen and set about making breakfast with an efficiency born of years of practice, and when the children came stumbling down the stairs, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, she had plates waiting for them. "Mama." Lily's voice was hushed, almost reverent. "Is this all for us?" "Every bite." Eliza smoothed her daughter's tangled hair, working through the knots with gentle fingers. "Eat slowly. Your stomach isn't used to this much food." Thomas was already seated, his fork moving methodically from plate to mouth. But she noticed that he was watching the door, his body tense with a wariness that had become second nature. "Where is he?" he asked between bites. "The man. His name is Mr. Rowan, and he's working in the pasture." "Is he coming back?" "It's his house, Thomas. Of course he's coming back." Her son's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked so much like Daniel that Eliza's breath caught. The same stubborn set to his chin, the same protective fierceness in his eyes. "I don't trust him." "Neither do I," Eliza admitted. "Not yet. But he gave us food and shelter when no one else would, and until he proves otherwise, we're going to treat him with respect. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded reluctantly, but she could see the argument still brewing behind his eyes. He would watch Caleb Rowan like a hawk watches a snake, waiting for the strike that might never come. Her boy had learned hard lessons in the months since his father's death, lessons about trust and betrayal and the cruelty that people were capable of when they thought no one was watching. She couldn't blame him for his suspicion. She could only hope that time would prove it unnecessary. After breakfast, she set the children to small tasks, Thomas to gather kindling from the woodpile, Lily to help dry the dishes, and then she began to explore. The house, she discovered, was larger than it had seemed the night before. Besides the main room and kitchen on the ground floor, there was a small study lined with books that surprised her with their variety. Novels and poetry sat alongside practical volumes on animal husbandry and crop rotation. There was even a worn copy of Shakespeare's complete works, its spine cracked from frequent reading. She ran her fingers along the leather binding, wondering about the man who lived here. The house told a story of contradictions. Sparse furnishings, but well-made ones. No decorations, but shelves full of books. A kitchen stocked for a family, but only one set of dishes showing regular use. It was the home of someone who had once expected more from life and had learned to live with less. The upstairs held 3 bedrooms, as Caleb had said, plus a small room at the end of the hall that made Eliza stop in the doorway with her heart suddenly racing. It was a nursery. The walls had been painted a soft yellow that had faded with time, and a cradle sat in the corner, covered with a sheet that couldn't quite hide its shape. There was a rocking chair by the window, a small dresser with carved wooden animals on top, a rag doll slumped against the pillow on the narrow bed. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust. Everything spoke of absence, of loss, of a door that had been closed and never reopened. Eliza backed out of the room and pulled the door shut behind her, her hands trembling. She understood now, or thought she did. The wife who was spoken of in whispers, the grief that hung around Caleb like a second shadow. This room was a grave, a memorial to something that had been lost and could never be recovered. She thought of her own grief, of the way Daniel's death had hollowed her out and left her walking through days that felt more like dreams. She thought of how people had told her to move on, to be strong, to think of the children, as if she weren't already thinking of the children every second of every day, as if their faces weren't the only thing that had kept her from giving up entirely. Maybe Caleb Rowan wasn't so different from her after all. Maybe he was just another person trying to survive a loss that felt impossible to bear. The morning passed quickly after that. Eliza cleaned the kitchen until it gleamed, more out of nervous energy than necessity. She found the vegetable garden behind the house and spent an hour pulling weeds and checking the state of the tomatoes and beans that had been left largely to their own devices. The children helped where they could and played where they couldn't, their laughter gradually growing less tentative as the morning wore on. It was nearly noon when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching, and she straightened from her work in the garden with her heart suddenly hammering. But it was only Caleb, riding in from the north pasture on a horse the color of storm clouds, his face shadowed by his hat brim. He dismounted by the barn and led the horse inside, and Eliza watched from the garden, uncertain whether to approach or wait. The question resolved itself when he emerged a few minutes later and walked directly toward her, his stride long and unhurried. "Mrs. Hart." He stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes taking in the state of the garden. "You've been busy." "I couldn't just sit idle, not after everything you've done." "I told you I don't expect—" "I know what you told me." She pulled off her gardening gloves, a pair she had found in the barn, and met his gaze directly. "But I'm not built for charity, Mr. Rowan. I need to earn my keep, or I'll go mad." Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or something like respect. "The garden needed attention, thank you. It's nothing compared to what you've given us." An awkward silence fell between them, the kind that happens when two strangers are suddenly forced into intimacy without the gradual building of trust. Eliza was acutely aware of her appearance, the dirt on her hands, the sweat dampening her hairline, the dress that had seen better days even before she started digging in soil. "The children look better," Caleb said finally. "There's color in their cheeks." One good meal can work wonders. Several good meals might work miracles. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "There's plenty of food. Make sure they eat as much as they want." "I will." "Thank you." Another silence, this one slightly less uncomfortable. Caleb shifted his weight, and she had the odd impression that he was as uncertain as she was, as unaccustomed to this strange new arrangement. "I should explain some things," he said, "about the ranch, about what needs doing." "I'm listening." He gestured toward the house, and they walked together, keeping a careful distance between them. "The cattle are out on the range, about 200 head. I ride out every day to check on them, move them to fresh grazing when needed. The horses need regular attention, feeding and grooming. The chickens and the milk cow are easier, but they still require daily care. I can handle chickens and a milk cow. I'm sure you can. But I'm not asking you to work, Mrs. Hart. I'm telling you what I do so you understand why I'm gone most of the day." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "Mr. Rowan, let me be clear about something. I am not going to sit in your house and eat your food and contribute nothing. It's not in my nature, and it would make me feel worse than scrounging behind the saloon ever did. If there's work that needs doing, let me do it. Please." He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "The house has been neglected for a while. The garden, as you've seen. The chicken coop needs repairs I haven't had time for. There's mending to be done, clothes I've been putting off because I hate needle and thread. I can do all of that. The children could help with small tasks, nothing dangerous, nothing too heavy, just things that would keep them busy and give them purpose." "They need purpose," Eliza agreed. "Especially Thomas. He's been carrying too much responsibility for too long, but he needs to feel useful, not coddled." "I understand." And somehow she believed he did. There was something in his voice when he spoke of the children, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his gruff exterior. She wondered again about the nursery upstairs, about the story behind that closed door. "Mr. Rowan," she began carefully, "I found a room upstairs. I didn't mean to intrude, but—" His face closed like a door slamming shut. "That room is off limits." "Of course. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "It's fine." His voice was clipped, final. "Just leave it alone." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The pain in his eyes was so raw, so fresh, despite what must have been years of carrying it, that she felt like an intruder just for having seen it. They walked the rest of the way to the house in silence, and when they reached the porch, Caleb stopped. "I'm going to work in the barn this afternoon. There's tack that needs repairing, equipment to maintain. I'll be close if you need anything." "Thank you." He turned to go, then paused. "Mrs. Hart?" "Yes?" "Call me Caleb. The Mr. Rowan makes me feel like my father." Despite everything, she almost smiled. Then you should call me Eliza. He nodded once, acknowledging the exchange without comment, and walked away toward the barn. She watched him go, this strange and silent man who had pulled her from the gutter without asking for anything in return. She still didn't understand him, wasn't sure she ever would, but she was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, she had landed somewhere safe. The afternoon brought clouds that rolled in from the mountains, threatening rain that never quite materialized. Eliza kept the children close, setting Thomas to sorting nails in the shed while Lily helped her take inventory of the pantry. The work was simple and soothing. The kind of routine that had once defined her days before Daniel's death had shattered everything. She found herself thinking about her husband as she worked, something she had been avoiding for months. Daniel Hart had been a good man, kind, hardworking, full of dreams that always seemed just out of reach. He had brought her west with promises of land and opportunity, of a future they would build together with their own hands. And for a while, it had seemed possible. The farm had been small but productive, the children healthy and happy, the life they were building exactly what she had always wanted. Then the fever came. 3 weeks from the first cough to the last breath. 3 weeks of watching the man she loved waste away, while she prayed and bargained and begged for a miracle that never came. And when it was over, when Daniel had been buried in the hard Wyoming earth with nothing but a wooden cross to mark his grave, she had discovered the truth about their situation. The farm was mortgaged, the debts were crushing, and the bank had no interest in extending mercy to a widow with 2 small children and no means of repayment. She had lost everything in the space of a month. The farm, the furniture, even most of her clothes had been sold to satisfy creditors who circled like vultures around a dying animal. By the time the dust settled, she had nothing left but her children and the contents of a single carpet bag. The months that followed had been a descent into a kind of hell she hadn't known existed. The good people of Bitter Creek had shown their true colors quickly. The women who had once shared recipes over her fence now crossed the street to avoid her. The men who had tipped their hats in greeting now looked through her as if she were invisible. She had applied for work at every business in town, had offered her services as a seamstress, a cook, a cleaner, a laundress. But no one would hire the widow Hart. Something about her situation, the scandal of poverty, the taint of failure, made her untouchable. And so she had fallen, by degrees, from respectable widow to desperate beggar. From sleeping in the boarding house to sleeping in barns. From buying food to begging for scraps. From pride to survival to something that was barely surviving at all. Until yesterday, until a stranger's shadow fell across her shame and changed everything. "Mama?" Lily's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Why are you crying?" Eliza touched her cheek and found it wet. "I'm not crying, sweetheart. Just thinking." "About Papa?" "Yes, about Papa." Lily climbed into her lap, all 6 years of her pressing close for comfort she was too young to know how to give. "I miss Papa too." "I know you do. But I like it here, Mama. It's warm, and there's food, and the bed is soft." She paused, considering. "Is it bad to like it here? Does that mean I don't miss Papa enough?" Eliza held her daughter close and breathed in the smell of her hair, clean now for the first time in weeks. "Liking it here doesn't mean you don't miss Papa. Your heart is big enough to hold both things at once, the missing and the liking, the sadness and the hope. That's a lot for one heart. Hearts are stronger than they look." The afternoon wore on, and the clouds thickened without releasing their burden. By evening, the air was heavy with the promise of rain, and when Eliza went to call the children for supper, she found Thomas in conversation with Caleb by the corral fence. She stopped at a distance, not wanting to interrupt but unable to stop herself from watching. Thomas stood rigid, his small body tense with suspicion, while Caleb leaned against the fence with the easy posture of a man who had learned patience from animals and weather and the slow turning of seasons. "Why did you help us?" she heard Thomas demand, his young voice sharp with challenge. "Nobody helps us. Nobody even looks at us anymore." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Does there have to be a reason?" "There's always a reason. Papa said you can't trust anyone who does something for nothing. They always want something back." "Your papa sounds like a smart man." "He was." Thomas's voice cracked on the words. "He was the smartest man I ever knew. And now he's dead and we have nothing and everyone treats us like we're garbage. So yeah, there has to be a reason. Eliza held her breath, waiting for Caleb's response. She half expected him to dismiss the boy's suspicion, to offer platitudes or easy reassurances. But he did neither. "You're right," he said quietly. "There is a reason." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" "I had a family once, a wife, a child." The words came slowly, pulled from somewhere deep and painful. "They died. Fever, same as took your papa. I buried them in the spring when the ground was soft enough to dig." Eliza's hand found her throat, pressing against the sudden ache there. "After that," Caleb continued, "I thought I was done. Thought I'd just work this ranch until I fell over, and then it wouldn't matter anymore because there'd be no one left to care. But then I saw you and your mama and your sister in that alley eating scraps like animals, and I thought—" He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough. "I thought about what I would have wanted for my wife and child if I had been the one to die first. I thought about whether anyone would have helped them, or whether they would have ended up in an alley somewhere too." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "So you helped us because of them? Your family?" "I helped you because you needed help, and I could give it. The reason doesn't matter much beyond that." "But you don't want anything from us?" "Not really. I want those circles under your sister's eyes to go away. I want your mother to stop jumping at shadows. I want you to be a boy again instead of a soldier." Caleb straightened from the fence, his gray eyes meeting Thomas's with an honesty that seemed to cost him something. "Is that wanting enough for you?" Thomas considered this with the gravity of someone much older than 8. "I think," he said finally, "that you might be telling the truth." "I am. I'm going to keep watching you anyway, just in case." Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of Caleb's mouth. "That's fair." Eliza stepped back into the shadows of the house, her heart too full for words. She understood something now that she hadn't before. Why Caleb had helped them, yes, but also something about the nature of grief itself. How it could hollow you out until there was nothing left but the shell of who you used to be. And how sometimes, unexpectedly, it could be the very thing that opened a door to something new. She wiped her eyes and called the children for supper, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. That night the rain finally came. It started slow, a gentle pattering on the roof that grew steadily louder until it became a drumming roar that drowned out all other sound. Eliza lay in bed listening to it, finding comfort in the noise after so many nights spent exposed to weather she couldn't escape. The children slept through the storm, exhausted by the day's activities and the safety of full bellies. But she couldn't quiet her mind enough to join them. She rose from bed and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, then made her way downstairs to the kitchen. She would make tea, she decided. Something warm to settle her thoughts. But when she reached the bottom of the stairs, she found she was not alone. Caleb stood at the window, his back to her, watching the rain sheet down in silver curtains. He wore only a shirt and trousers, his feet bare on the wooden floor, and something about the vulnerability of his posture made her hesitate in the doorway. "Can't sleep?" he asked without turning around. "How did you know I was here?" Heard the stairs creak. She moved to stand beside him, keeping a respectful distance. The window showed nothing but darkness and rain, the lamplight reflecting their ghostly images back at them. "I couldn't sleep either," she admitted. "Too much thinking." "Dangerous habit, thinking." "So I've been told." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the storm together. The thunder had faded, leaving only the rain and the distant drip of water finding its way through gutters. "I heard what you said to Thomas," Eliza said quietly. "About your family." Caleb's shoulders tightened, but he didn't turn away. "I don't usually talk about them." "I know. I'm sorry if—" "Don't be." He finally turned to look at her, and in the lamplight his face seemed softer somehow, the hard edges worn down by the darkness. He needed to hear it, needed to understand that I'm not some kind of monster with hidden intentions. "You're not a monster. You don't know me well enough to say that." "Maybe not." She met his gaze steadily. "But I know that monsters don't give up their beds for strangers. They don't stock pantries, they don't mean to share. They don't talk to suspicious little boys with patience and honesty instead of threats and intimidation. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, at being seen so clearly. You notice a lot. I've learned to notice. It's how you survive when you have nothing else. The rain continued its assault on the roof, filling the silence that stretched between them. Eliza found herself studying his face, cataloging the details she had been too afraid to examine before. The lines at the corners of his eyes, etched by sun and squinting at distant horizons. The gray in his hair at the temples, premature but dignified. The set of his jaw, stubborn and strong, and somehow unbearably sad. "What were their names?" she asked softly. "Your wife and child?" For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Sarah. And the boy was Benjamin. He was only 2 when—" He couldn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. "I'm sorry," Eliza said, though the words felt inadequate. "I'm so sorry. It was 4 years ago. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't follow any rules." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." They stood together in the rain-washed darkness, 2 strangers bound by loss and circumstance, and something passed between them that Eliza couldn't name. Not attraction, not exactly, though she wasn't blind to the way the lamplight gilded his features or the solid strength of his presence beside her. It was something quieter than that, recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that they were both survivors of the same war, carrying the same wounds, trying to find a way forward through the wreckage. "You should sleep," Caleb said finally. "Morning comes early on a ranch." "So I'm learning." He moved toward the door that led to the barn, then stopped. Eliza. Her heart stuttered at the sound of her name in his voice, rough and soft at once. "The children," he said. "Thomas and Lily. They're good children. You've done well with them, despite everything." The compliment hit harder than she expected, cracking something loose in her chest. "Thank you. That means more than you know." He nodded once, that brief acknowledgement she was beginning to recognize as his way of ending conversations, and then he was gone. Out into the rain, across the yard to the barn, disappearing into the darkness like a ghost. Eliza stood at the window for a long time after he left, watching the storm spend itself against the mountains. Her mind was full of questions without answers, possibilities without guarantees, the uncertain future that stretched before her like an uncharted map. But for the first time in months, the future didn't terrify her. It was still frightening, still unknown, still full of dangers she couldn't predict. But there was something else now, something that hadn't been there yesterday. A foundation, however fragile. A roof against the rain. A stranger who was becoming, by slow degrees, something more. She climbed the stairs and returned to her room, and when sleep finally came, she dreamed of yellow nurseries and small wooden animals, and a voice that said, "You belong here." The dream felt like a promise. Or maybe, she thought as consciousness faded, it was just the beginning of hope becoming something stronger. Something that might, with time and care and the steady accumulation of ordinary days, become a life worth living again. The rain continued through the night, washing the dust from the windows and the weariness from her soul. And in the barn, in the small room he had made his refuge from memory and loss, Caleb Rowan lay awake and listened to the storm and thought about the woman sleeping in his house. The widow with the fierce eyes and the broken pride, and the children who looked at him like he might be either salvation or destruction. He didn't know which he was yet, but for the first time in 4 years, he wanted to find out. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Eliza had almost forgotten existed. The quiet predictability of days that began with sunrise and ended with the last light fading behind the mountains. She rose each morning before the children woke, lit the stove, gathered eggs from the coop, and had breakfast waiting by the time small feet came padding down the stairs. Caleb would appear briefly to collect coffee and whatever food she pressed into his hands, then disappear into the endless work of the ranch until evening brought him back, tired and quiet, and somehow less distant than he had been the day before. It was not happiness exactly. The wounds were too fresh for that, the scars too raw. But it was something close to peace, a ceasefire in the war she had been fighting since Daniel's death. Thomas began to thaw first, his rigid suspicion softening into cautious curiosity as the days passed without threat or betrayal. Eliza watched him follow Caleb to the barn one morning, keeping a careful distance but drawn by something stronger than his fear. He came back 2 hours later with dirt on his knees and a light in his eyes she hadn't seen in months. "Mr. Rowan let me help with the horses," he announced, his voice trying for casual and failing completely. "He says I have good hands. Steady." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. He's going to teach me to ride properly, not like Papa did, with the plow horse. Really ride. On a real horse." The mention of Daniel sent a familiar pang through her chest, but she kept her smile steady. "I'm glad. You'll be a fine rider." "Mama?" Thomas hesitated, something shifting in his expression. "Is it okay? To like him, I mean. To like being here. It doesn't mean I've forgotten Papa, does it?" She knelt down and took his face in her hands, looking into eyes that were so like her own. "Your Papa would want you to be happy, Thomas. He would want you to learn and grow and become the man he always knew you could be. Liking it here, liking Mr. Rowan, that's not betrayal. That's survival. And surviving is the best way to honor the people we've lost." He nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Okay, I wanted to make sure." "I'm sure, sweetheart. Now go wash up. Lunch is almost ready." Lily's transformation was gentler, slower, but no less profound. The hollows in her cheeks began to fill out, the shadows under her eyes fading with each night of restful sleep. She discovered the chickens and adopted them as her personal responsibility, naming each one and reporting their daily activities to anyone who would listen. One morning, Eliza found her sitting on the porch with Caleb, the two of them watching the sunrise in companionable silence while Lily chattered about which hen had laid the most eggs that week. "Henrietta is the best," Lily was saying with grave authority. "She gives 2 eggs almost every day. But Mabel is lazy. She just sits in the corner and looks at everyone like she's too good for laying." "Some chickens are like that," Caleb agreed, his voice carrying that same gentle patience she had heard him use with Thomas. "Got to accept them as they are." "Mama says people are like that too. Some work hard and some just sit and judge everyone else." "Your mama is a smart woman." Lily beamed at him, all 6 years of her radiating approval. "I like you, Mr. Rowan. You're nice." Something flickered across Caleb's face, pain perhaps, or something like it. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I like you too, Miss Lily. You're good company." Eliza watched from the kitchen window, her hands still in the dishwater, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She had been so afraid that this refuge would prove false, afraid that Caleb's kindness would curdle into something darker, afraid that she was trading one form of desperation for another. But with each passing day, those fears grew smaller, quieter, easier to ignore. The ranch began to show signs of care it had been missing for years. Eliza attacked the house with the fierce energy of someone who needed to prove her worth, scrubbing floors and washing windows and mending curtains that had gone gray with neglect. The vegetable garden flourished under her attention, producing tomatoes and beans and squash that she preserved in jars she found in the cellar. She took over the cooking entirely, transforming the simple ingredients of bachelor meals into dishes that made Caleb pause with his fork halfway to his mouth, something like wonder in his eyes. He searched for words, found none adequate. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother." She believed that food was love made visible. Eliza smiled at the memory, bittersweet and tender. "I haven't had much chance to cook properly in a long time. It feels good to do it again." "It's good," he said simply, and returned to his meal with the focused attention of a man who had forgotten what real food tasted like. But peace, Eliza was learning, was not the same as safety. And in a town like Bitter Creek, the eyes of neighbors missed nothing. The first whispers reached them through Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who ran the mercantile and was one of the few people in town who had shown Eliza any kindness during her months of desperation. She arrived at the ranch one afternoon in a wagon loaded with supplies Caleb had ordered, her weathered face creased with concern. "I thought you should know," she said to Eliza, her voice low, despite the fact that they were alone in the kitchen. "People are talking." Eliza's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice calm. People are always talking, Mrs. Patterson. It's what they do best. This is different. The older woman glanced toward the window, as if checking for listeners. They're saying, well, they're saying things about you and Mr. Rowan, about the arrangement here, about what kind of woman moves into a man's house without a ring on her finger. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of cold through Eliza's chest. She had known this was coming, had braced herself for it from the moment she climbed onto Caleb's wagon. But knowing something intellectually was different from feeling it, the sharp edge of judgment, the weight of assumptions made by people who had never bothered to understand. "It's not like that," she said quietly. We've never. "I know, child, I know." Mrs. Patterson reached out and patted her hand with papery fingers. "But what I know and what people choose to believe are two different things. The Women's Society has been particularly vocal. Mrs. Henderson has made it her personal mission to spread the story far and wide." "Of course she has." Eliza's voice came out bitter despite her best efforts. "She's been looking for reasons to destroy me since Daniel died. She's a small woman with a smaller heart, but she has influence and she's using it. There's talk of bringing the matter before the church, of making it official." "Official how?" Mrs. Patterson's face told her everything she needed to know. "They want to declare your living here immoral, want to pressure Mr. Rowan to send you away. Or worse." "Worse?" "There's been mention of, I don't want to say it, dear, but women in your situation have been run out of towns before, and not always gently." The kitchen felt suddenly cold despite the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Eliza thought of her children, of the peace they had finally found, of the light that had begun to return to their eyes. She thought of everything she had endured to keep them safe, the hunger, the humiliation, the endless degradation of poverty, and felt something hot and fierce rise up in her chest. "I won't leave," she said, her voice steady with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. "They can talk all they want, but I won't leave. Not unless Caleb asks me to." Mrs. Patterson studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering in her faded eyes. "You're stronger than they think you are, Eliza Hart. Don't let them break you." "I won't." But after the older woman left, Eliza sat alone at the kitchen table and let the strength drain out of her. The whispers were just beginning. Soon they would become shouts, and then actions, and then what? She had seen how quickly a community could turn on someone it decided was unworthy. She had lived it, had felt the cold shoulder of neighbors who had once smiled at her across church pews. She couldn't put Caleb through that, couldn't let his kindness become his ruin. When he came in that evening, tired and dusty from a day spent mending fences in the far pasture, she was waiting for him at the table. The children had been sent to bed early with stories and promises, and the house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the distant song of crickets. "Something's wrong," Caleb said immediately, reading her face with an accuracy that surprised her. "What happened?" "Mrs. Patterson came today." He sat down across from her, his gray eyes steady on hers. "And?" "The town is talking. About us. About this arrangement." She forced herself to hold his gaze. "They're saying that we're... I can imagine what they're saying. They want me gone, Caleb. They want to run me out of town, or worse. And if I stay here, if I keep living under your roof, they'll come after you too. They'll destroy your reputation, your business, everything you've built." Something hardened in his jaw. "Let them try. You don't understand. These people, the Women's Society, they have power. They can make your life impossible. They can turn every merchant against you, every rancher, every person you might ever need to do business with. I've seen them do it before. I've been on the receiving end of it. I know what they're capable of." His voice was flat, controlled, but she could see the anger burning beneath the surface. "I've lived in this town for 15 years, Eliza. I've watched them destroy people for sport. I've watched them pat themselves on the back while they ruined lives and called it righteousness. Then you know why I have to leave." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Eliza felt tears pressing against the backs of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had made her decision. She had to protect him, protect her children, protect whatever fragile thing had begun to grow in this house. No. Caleb's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. You don't have to leave. You're not going anywhere. Caleb, listen to me. He leaned forward, his intensity suddenly filling the space between them. I don't care what they say. I don't care what they think. The only opinions that matter to me are the ones in this house, yours and those children's and mine. Everything else is just noise. It's not just noise when they come with torches and pitchforks. Then I'll meet them at the gate with a rifle and they can explain their righteousness to the barrel. You can't fight an entire town. Watch me. She stared at him, this man she had known for barely a month, and felt something shift inside her chest. He meant it. She could see it in every line of his body, hear it in every word he spoke. He would fight for her. He would stand against the whole world if that's what it took to keep her and her children safe. No one had ever fought for her before. Not like this. Not without conditions or expectations or hidden agendas. Why? The word came out broken, desperate. Why would you risk everything for us? We're nothing to you. Strangers you pulled out of an alley. You could have anyone, any respectable woman in the territory. Why this? Why us? Caleb was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough, with something she couldn't quite identify. Because I was dead before you came here. He held her gaze, letting her see past the walls he had built, past the stone and the silence and the years of solitary grief. I was walking and breathing and working, but I was dead inside. I buried my heart with Sarah and Benjamin, and I thought that was the end of it. I thought I'd just exist until existing wasn't required anymore. Eliza couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only watch as this man who never spoke of anything personal laid himself bare before her. Then I saw you in that alley, he continued. Saw you feeding your children garbage while the whole town looked the other way. Saw that boy of yours trying to protect you with nothing but his small fists and his desperate courage. And something woke up inside me that I thought had died forever. Caleb, you asked me once why I helped you. I told you I couldn't watch those children starve. That was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. He took a breath, steadying himself. The whole truth is that when I looked at you, at your pride and your pain and your refusal to give up even when giving up would have been easier, I saw something I had forgotten existed. I saw hope. And I couldn't let that die, Eliza. I couldn't watch hope die again. The tears she had been fighting finally broke free, streaming down her cheeks in hot rivers she couldn't control. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell him that she understood, that she felt the same pull toward him, that somewhere in the weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations and the slow building of trust, something had changed inside her too, but the words wouldn't come. Everything she felt was too big, too new, too terrifying to put into language. Caleb reached across the table and took her hand, the first time he had touched her since helping her down from the wagon that first day. His palm was rough and warm, calloused from years of work, and the contact sent a shock through her system that she felt in her bones. Stay, he said simply. Let them talk. Let them judge. Let them do whatever they need to do to feel righteous and superior, but don't let them win. Don't let them take this from you, from us, before we even know what it could become. What could it become? I don't know. His thumb traced a slow circle on the back of her hand, the touch gentle despite the roughness of his skin. But I'd like to find out, if you're willing. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw everything he wasn't saying, the loneliness that had been his companion for 4 years, the grief that had hollowed him out and left him walking through days that held no meaning, the desperate, fragile hope that had begun to bloom in the presence of her and her children, just as it had begun to bloom in her in the presence of him. I'm willing, she whispered. I'm terrified, but I'm willing. Something shifted in his expression, relief perhaps, or joy, or something that combined both and transcended either. He squeezed her hand once, then released it, returning to himself with visible effort. We should talk to the children tomorrow. Explain the situation. They're going to hear things in town, and they should be prepared. Thomas already doesn't trust outsiders. This will only make it worse. Maybe, or maybe it will teach him that some things are worth fighting for. Eliza wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, feeling raw and exposed and somehow lighter than she had in years. "You're not what I expected, Caleb Rowan. Neither are you." They sat together in the firelight as the evening deepened around them, not touching but connected in a way that went deeper than physical contact. Outside, the Wyoming night wrapped around the ranch like a dark blanket, full of dangers they couldn't see and challenges they couldn't predict. But inside, in this moment, there was warmth and safety and the beginning of something neither of them had thought they would ever feel again. Tomorrow would bring judgment and whispers and the cold cruelty of small minds. Tomorrow would bring the fight they both knew was coming. But tonight, they had each other. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, that felt like enough. The confrontation came sooner than Eliza had expected. 3 days after Mrs. Patterson's warning, a delegation arrived at the ranch in a wagon so polished it seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Mrs. Henderson sat in front, her iron gray hair pinned beneath a hat that cost more than Eliza had earned in the past year. Behind her sat 2 other women from the society. Mrs. Baker, whose husband owned the bank that had foreclosed on Daniel's farm, and Mrs. Collins, the minister's wife, whose presence lent the visit an air of official sanction. Eliza saw them coming from the kitchen window and felt her stomach drop. But she straightened her spine, smoothed her apron, and walked out onto the porch to meet them with her head held high. "Mrs. Henderson," she made her voice polite, neutral. "Ladies, what brings you all the way out here?" "I think you know very well what brings us, Mrs. Hart." Mrs. Henderson's voice could have frozen water in August. "We've come to discuss your situation." "My situation?" "Your living arrangements, your presence in the home of an unmarried man, your flagrant disregard for decency and moral standards." "I wasn't aware that accepting shelter for my starving children was a moral failing," Mrs. Baker sniffed. "Don't play innocent with us. We all know what goes on in houses where unmarried men and women cohabitate. The sin? The impropriety? Nothing improper has happened in this house." Eliza's voice was steady despite the anger building in her chest. "Mr. Rowan has been nothing but respectful. He sleeps in the barn. I sleep in the house with my children. There is nothing for you to concern yourselves with." "Your word," Mrs. Henderson said coldly, "is hardly sufficient proof. The appearance of impropriety is nearly as damaging as the act itself. Surely you understand that." "What I understand is that you've come here to judge me without evidence, condemn me without trial, and feel righteous about destroying the only security my children have ever known since their father died." Eliza descended the porch steps, moving closer to the wagon despite every instinct telling her to retreat. "What I understand is that not one of you lifted a finger to help me when I was starving in your streets. Not one of you offered food or shelter or even basic human kindness. You watched me fall, and you did nothing." "We tried to help," Mrs. Collins began, but Eliza cut her off. "You tried to help by telling every merchant in town not to hire me. You tried to help by whispering to every household that I was too tainted to work in their kitchens. You tried to help by making sure that every door in Bitter Creek was closed to me and my children." She was shaking now, months of humiliation and fear finally finding an outlet. "Don't you dare stand there and pretend you wanted anything but my destruction." Mrs. Henderson's face had gone red with fury. "How dare you speak to us this way? We are respectable women." "You are vultures," Eliza's voice cracked like a whip. "Feeding on the misery of others and calling it moral obligation. Well, I'm done being your meal. I'm done apologizing for surviving. And I'm done pretending that your opinion matters to anyone with a conscience." "You will regret this." Mrs. Henderson's eyes were narrow and cold. "We will make sure of it." "Is that a threat, Mrs. Henderson?" The voice came from behind Eliza, deep and flat and utterly without warmth. She turned to find Caleb standing in the yard, his rifle cradled casually in the crook of his arm. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't known he was even nearby, but the sight of him standing there, solid and calm and unmistakably dangerous, sent a rush of relief through her body. "Mr. Rowan?" Mrs. Henderson's tone shifted, becoming slightly less certain. "We've come to discuss—" "I heard what you've come to discuss. I've been listening for the past 5 minutes." He moved to stand beside Eliza, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. And I want to make something very clear to you ladies. Mrs. Hart is a guest in my home. She is here because she needed help, and I was able to provide it. What happens under my roof is my business and no one else's. But surely you understand. What I understand is that you've come onto my property to harass a woman who has done nothing wrong. What I understand is that you're so desperate for something to feel superior about that you're willing to destroy an innocent family to get it. His voice hadn't risen, but the intensity of it made the women in the wagon shrink back. What I understand is that if I ever see any of you on my land again, I won't be nearly as polite about asking you to leave. Mrs. Henderson's face had gone pale beneath her expensive hat. You can't threaten us. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm stating facts. This is my property. You're not welcome on it. The conversation is over. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mrs. Baker leaned over and whispered something to the driver, and the wagon began to turn, its polished wheels raising small clouds of dust as it retreated down the road toward town. Eliza stood watching until it disappeared over the first rise, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. Then she turned to Caleb, who was standing with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the horizon. Thank you, she said quietly. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. He finally looked at her, and she saw something fierce burning in his gray eyes. No one speaks to you that way. Not while I'm breathing. They'll come back. This isn't over. I know. They'll bring the minister next time, or the sheriff, or both. Let them. She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tension coiled in his muscles. Caleb, you can't fight everyone. You can't. I can try. He covered her hand with his own, holding it against his arm. Eliza, I meant what I said the other night. I don't care what they think, what they say, what they try to do. You and those children are staying here. This is your home now, and I will defend it with everything I have. Your home, she echoed softly. You said your home. Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability she had never seen before. I did. Is that all right? She looked at him, this man who had pulled her from the gutter, who had given her children a future, who was willing to stand against an entire town to protect them. She thought about everything she had lost and everything she had found, about grief and hope and the impossible miracle of second chances. It's more than all right, she said, and watched the tension drain from his shoulders. It's everything. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Eliza sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge one by one above the mountains. She heard the door open behind her, felt Caleb's presence before he settled into the chair beside her. I've been thinking, he said quietly. About what? About how to make this easier, for you, for the children, for all of us. She turned to look at him, his profile sharp against the darkening sky. What do you mean? He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other. But if we were married, if you had my name, my protection, they couldn't touch you. They couldn't say anything, couldn't do anything. You'd be safe. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Are you proposing to me? No, not really. Not yet. He finally turned to look at her, and in the starlight, his eyes were softer than she had ever seen them. I'm asking if it's something you might consider, someday, when you're ready, if you're ever ready. She thought about Daniel, about the love they had shared and the life they had built, and the way it had all crumbled to dust. She thought about the fear that had been her constant companion for so long, the certainty that she would never be safe again, never be loved again, never be whole again. And then she thought about Caleb, his steady presence, his quiet strength, the way he looked at her children like they were precious beyond measure. She thought about the life they could build together, the home they could make, the family they could become. I might consider it, she said softly. Someday, when we're both ready. He nodded, accepting her answer without pushing for more. That's all I needed to know. They sat together in the darkness, not touching, but connected by something stronger than touch. The stars wheeled overhead, the mountains stood sentinel on the horizon, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a rescue. It was something messier and more complicated than that. Two broken people finding in each other the strength to keep going. Two people who had lost everything discovering that maybe, just maybe, they still had something left to give. The storms weren't over. The judgment would continue, the whispers would grow louder, the threats would become more real. But they would face it together, this unlikely family forged in desperation and tempered by something that was beginning, slowly and tentatively, to feel like love. And in that moment, watching the stars and feeling the warmth of Caleb's presence beside her, Eliza allowed herself to believe that everything might actually be okay. Not perfect, not easy, but okay. For now, that was more than enough. The autumn arrived with a sudden ferocity that caught even Caleb off guard, sweeping down from the mountains in sheets of cold wind that stripped the last golden leaves from the aspens and left the world looking raw and exposed. Eliza stood at the kitchen window watching the first frost crystallize on the grass and felt the seasons change echo something inside her own heart, a sense of things ending and beginning, of old chapters closing and new ones waiting to be written. 2 months had passed since the confrontation with Mrs. Henderson and the Women's Society. 2 months of whispers and cold shoulders in town, of merchants who suddenly had no change to make or goods to sell whenever she appeared at their counters. 2 months of Caleb's steady presence, his quiet protection, his patience that never seemed to waver no matter how heavy the burden became. The children had flourished despite it all, or perhaps because of it. Thomas had grown 2 inches and gained back the weight he had lost during their months of starvation, his face filling out until he looked like the healthy 8-year-old boy he was supposed to be. He spent his mornings helping Caleb with the horses and his afternoons devouring the books from the study, working his way through adventure stories and histories with an appetite that reminded Eliza painfully of Daniel. Her husband had loved books too, had dreamed of sending Thomas to a proper school someday, of giving him opportunities that life on the frontier rarely provided. Lily had become Caleb's shadow, following him around the ranch with her constant stream of chatter and questions that would have exhausted anyone else. But Caleb answered each one with the same patient attention, explaining how to mend a fence, or why the cows needed to be moved to different pastures, or what the different bird calls meant. He had taught her to identify tracks in the mud, to predict weather from the clouds, to whistle loud enough to call the dogs from the far side of the property. And somewhere along the way, without anyone quite noticing when it happened, she had stopped calling him Mr. Rowan and started calling him simply Caleb. "Caleb says we might get snow next week," she announced one evening at dinner, her small face serious with the weight of this meteorological prediction. "He says he can feel it in his bones." "Can he now?" Eliza smiled at Caleb across the table, catching the slight embarrassment that flickered across his features. "It's not magic," he said gruffly. "Just experience. You live through enough winters, you learn to read the signs." "What signs?" Thomas asked, his natural skepticism warring with his growing respect for the man who had become, in so many ways, a father to him. "The way the animals behave, the color of the sky at sunset, the feel of the air on your skin." Caleb paused, considering. "My father used to say the land talks to you if you learn to listen. Took me years to understand what he meant." "Will you teach me?" Thomas asked, and there was something in his voice, a longing, a hunger, that made Eliza's heart ache. "To listen, I mean. To understand what the land is saying." Caleb looked at the boy for a long moment, and Eliza saw something pass between them, an acknowledgement, a promise. "Yes," he said simply, "I'll teach you everything I know." The words hung in the air like a vow, and Eliza felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She turned away before anyone could see, busying herself with the dishes while the children finished their meal. But she felt Caleb's gaze on her back, warm and steady as a hand pressed between her shoulder blades. Later, after the children had gone to bed and the house had settled into its evening quiet, she found him on the porch staring out at the darkness. The temperature had dropped sharply with sunset, and she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she settled into the chair beside his. "You're good with them," she said quietly. "With Thomas especially. He needs what you're giving him. He's a good boy, smart, determined. Reminds me of myself at that age." Caleb's voice was soft, contemplative. "Before everything went wrong." "What went wrong?" He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then, my father died when I was 12. Accident with the cattle. He was trampled trying to save a calf that had gotten caught in a fence. Took him 3 days to die, and we couldn't afford a doctor to ease his passing. Caleb, I'm sorry. My mother lasted another 2 years. Worked herself to death trying to keep the ranch going, trying to hold everything together for me and my brother. By the time I was 15, I was alone. My brother had gone east, looking for an easier life. I never blamed him for leaving. This land, it takes everything from you if you let it. Eliza reached out and took his hand, twining her fingers through his. His palm was rough and warm, the hand of a man who had spent his entire life working, fighting, surviving. But you stayed. I stayed. He turned his hand over, capturing hers more securely. I built this ranch from nothing, found Sarah, married her, thought we'd have the life my parents never got to have. And then, you don't have to talk about it. I want to. He looked at her, and in the starlight his eyes were luminous with old grief. I've never talked about it, not to anyone. But I want you to know, Eliza. I want you to understand why I am the way I am. She squeezed his hand in silent encouragement, and he continued. Sarah was sunlight. That's the only way I can describe her. She walked into a room, and everything got brighter. I met her at a church social in town, and I knew within 5 minutes that I was going to marry her. Took me 2 years to convince her, but she finally said yes. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. We had 5 good years, 5 years of building something together, of planning and dreaming and believing that the future would be kind to us. And then Benjamin came. His voice cracked slightly on the name, the first time she had heard him speak it since that night in the kitchen. He was perfect, Eliza, perfect and beautiful, and everything I never knew I wanted until I held him in my arms. I would watch him sleep for hours, just watching, memorizing every detail of his face, afraid that if I looked away he might disappear. What happened? Caleb closed his eyes, and she saw the muscles in his jaw working as he fought for control. Fever. It swept through the valley that spring, took 6 people before it was done. Sarah went first. She was trying to nurse a neighbor's child and brought it home with her. She lasted a week. Benjamin lasted 3 days after she was gone. I buried them together in the meadow behind the house where Sarah used to pick wildflowers. Eliza felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't try to stop them. Oh, Caleb. I wanted to die after that. I stood at their graves, and I thought about how easy it would be to just stop. Stop eating, stop working, stop breathing. Let the land take me the way it had taken everyone I ever loved. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and she saw the raw truth of what he was telling her. But I couldn't do it. Some stubborn part of me refused to give up, even when I wanted to. So I kept going, day after day, year after year, not living exactly, just existing. Until you. He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the gesture unbearably tender. Until that day in the alley when I saw you fighting for your children with everything you had, refusing to surrender even when surrender would have been easier. I saw myself in you, Eliza, the part of myself I thought had died with Sarah and Benjamin. I didn't feel strong that day. I felt broken. Broken and strong aren't opposites. Sometimes they're the same thing. She turned her face into his palm, pressing her cheek against his calloused skin. I don't know what we're doing, Caleb. I don't know what this is or where it's going. Neither do I. His voice was rough but honest. But I know what I feel. I know that when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is whether you slept well. I know that when I'm out in the fields, I'm counting the hours until I can come home and see your face. I know that your children have become yours, she finished softly. They've become yours too. Yes. The word came out like a confession. Is that wrong? Is it too soon? It's not wrong. She looked up at him, at this man who had given her everything without asking for anything in return. It's not too soon. It's exactly right. He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes, hope battling against fear, love struggling to break free of the grief that had imprisoned it for so long. Then, slowly, Giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than an answer. Eliza felt it in every part of her body, the warmth of his mouth, the roughness of his skin, the tenderness that seemed so at odds with his hard exterior. She kissed him back, and the world contracted to this single point of contact, this moment of connection that changed everything. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. "I should have asked first," Caleb said, his voice unsteady. "I should have. You didn't need to ask." She touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "I've been wanting you to do that for weeks." "You have?" "I have." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, the sound so unexpected that it made her smile. I thought maybe I was imagining things, seeing what I wanted to see." "You weren't imagining anything." They sat together in the darkness, hands intertwined, the night pressing close around them like a blanket. The cold had deepened, and Eliza could see her breath misting in the air, but she couldn't bring herself to go inside. Not yet. Not when everything felt so fragile and precious and new. "I should tell you something," Caleb said eventually, "about the town, about what's coming." The warmth she had been feeling cooled slightly at his tone. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Patterson came by earlier today while you were in the garden. She had news." He paused, and she felt his hand tighten around hers. "The Women's Society has convinced the minister to take action. They're planning to bring it before the church council next Sunday. Make an official declaration that our arrangement is immoral and demand that we either separate or face consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "Excommunication, social ostracism, pressure on every business in town to refuse to serve either of us." His voice was flat, controlled. "They've also been talking to the sheriff about possible violations of decency laws. There's no law that actually applies, but they're hoping the threat will be enough." Eliza felt the familiar cold of fear settling in her stomach. "So we're back to where we started?" "No." He turned to face her fully, his eyes fierce in the starlight. "We're nowhere close to where we started. You're not alone anymore, Eliza. You're not fighting this by yourself. Whatever comes, we face it together." "They'll destroy you," she whispered. "Everything you've built, everything you've worked for. I don't care about any of that. I care about you. I care about Thomas and Lily." He took both her hands in his, gripping them tightly. "I care about this family we've built, this life we're making, and I will not let a group of small-minded hypocrites take it away from us." "What are we going to do?" He was silent for a moment, and she could see him thinking, planning, strategizing. "We're going to give them what they want, or at least what they say they want." "I don't understand." "They want respectability. They want to feel like they've won, like they've forced us to conform to their standards." A strange smile crossed his face. "So we'll give them a wedding, a proper, legal, indisputable wedding that makes you my wife and removes any ground they have to stand on." Eliza's breath caught. "Caleb." "I know what I said before, that I wasn't proposing, not really, but things are different now." He lifted her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Eliza Hart. I didn't expect it, didn't plan for it, but there it is. I love you, and I love your children, and I want to spend whatever time I have left on this earth making sure all of you are safe and happy and loved." The tears were flowing freely now, and she didn't try to stop them. "You're asking me to marry you." "I'm asking you to let me be your husband, your partner, the father your children deserve." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm asking you to let me love you, properly and completely, for as long as we both live." She looked at him through her tears. This man she had feared and distrusted and slowly, impossibly, fallen in love with. She thought about everything they had been through, everything they had survived, everything that still lay ahead of them. She thought about Daniel, about the love they had shared and the life they had built, and she knew with absolute certainty that he would want this for her. Would want her to be happy, to be safe, to be loved. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like a door opening onto a future she had never dared to imagine. "Yes, I'll marry you." Caleb's face transformed. The hard lines softening, the grief receding, joy breaking through like sunlight through storm clouds. He pulled her close and kissed her again, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. This was a claiming, a promise, a beginning. When they finally broke apart, both of them were shaking. "We should tell the children in the morning," Eliza said. "Let them be part of this." "Are you worried about how they'll react?" "Lily will be thrilled. She's been asking when you're going to become her papa for weeks." She smiled at his startled expression. "You didn't notice?" No, I didn't notice. Thomas might be harder. He loved his father so much, and the idea of someone taking Daniel's place, I don't want to take Daniel's place." Caleb's voice was serious, earnest. "Daniel was their father. Nothing changes that. I just want to be here, to love them, and protect them, and help them grow into the people they're meant to be. Not as a replacement, but as something new." "That's exactly what I'll tell him." They sat together until the cold finally drove them inside, and even then they lingered in the warmth of the kitchen, reluctant to separate. It wasn't until the clock struck midnight that Eliza finally forced herself to climb the stairs, pausing at the top to look back at Caleb standing in the doorway. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "Everything changes tomorrow." "Everything changed the day you climbed onto my wagon," he replied. "Tomorrow is just the world catching up." She smiled, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. Then she went to her room and lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the future that had suddenly become possible. The morning brought chaos. Eliza woke to the sound of hoofbeats, many hoofbeats, more than should be approaching the ranch at dawn. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully awake, and what she saw made her blood run cold. A group of riders was coming up the road toward the house, at least a dozen of them. Even from this distance, she could see that they weren't coming in peace. Several of them carried torches despite the morning light, and the lead rider held something that looked distressingly like a rope. "Mama?" Thomas's voice came from the doorway, thick with sleep. "What's happening?" "Get your sister, get dressed. Don't come downstairs until I tell you." She kept her voice calm despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Do you understand me, Thomas? Stay upstairs no matter what you hear." "But do as I say." She was already moving, throwing on clothes with fumbling hands, her mind racing through possibilities and finding none of them good. She reached the bottom of the stairs just as Caleb came through the front door, his rifle in his hands and his face set in hard lines. "I saw them," she said. "Who are they?" "Trouble." He checked the rifle, verified it was loaded, then moved to the window. "Carter Mills and some of his friends, from the look of it. They've been drinking, or they wouldn't be stupid enough to try something like this." "What are they going to try?" Caleb didn't answer, which was answer enough. The riders reached the yard and fanned out in a loose semicircle around the house, their horses shifting nervously beneath them. Carter Mills sat at the center, his face red with drink and rage, the rope in his hands forming a noose that made Eliza's stomach lurch. "Rowan!" Carter's voice was a slurred shout. "Get out here and face us like a man!" Caleb stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. Eliza followed, refusing to cower inside while he faced this alone. "You're on my property, Mills." Caleb's voice was flat, calm. "I suggest you leave before you do something you'll regret." "The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner." Carter's eyes moved to Eliza, and the hatred in them was naked and ugly. "You've been harboring that whore for months, Rowan, letting her live in your house, corrupting everything she touches. It's time someone did something about it. If you have a problem with how I live my life, take it up with the law. This vigilante nonsense is beneath even you." "The law?" Carter laughed, and several of his companions joined in. "The law doesn't care about women like her, but we do. We care about keeping our town decent, keeping our families safe from her kind." "Her kind." Caleb's voice dropped to something dangerous. "You mean widows? Mothers? Women who had the misfortune of losing their husbands and being left with nothing?" "I mean women who spread their legs for any man willing to take them in." Carter spat on the ground. "I mean women who corrupt decent households and ruin good men. I mean women who should have been run out of town months ago." Eliza felt the words like physical blows, But she didn't flinch. She had heard worse. She had survived worse. And she would not give this man the satisfaction of seeing her cower. "You're a coward, Carter Mills." Her voice rang out clear and strong, surprising even herself. A coward and a bully who can't stand to see a woman refuse him. That's what this is really about, isn't it? I said no to you in that alley, and your pride couldn't take it. Carter's face went purple with rage. "You shut your mouth." "I won't shut my mouth. I've been silent long enough, letting people like you define who I am and what I'm worth. But I'm done being silent." She stepped forwards until she was standing at the edge of the porch, looking down at the men who had come to destroy her. "You want to run me out of town? Go ahead and try. You want to call me names, spread lies about me, make my life miserable? I've survived worse than anything you can do. But you will not make me ashamed of accepting help when I needed it, of finding a home for my children when the rest of you left us to starve." "Eliza." Caleb's voice was tight with warning, but she couldn't stop. "Every single one of you has walked past me in the street, watched my children go hungry, refused to lift a finger while we scraped and begged and struggled just to survive. And now you come here with your torches and your rope and your righteous indignation, and you dare to call me the problem?" She laughed, and the sound was bitter and sharp. "Look at yourselves, really look, and then tell me who the decent ones are." Silence fell over the yard, a stunned, uncertain silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. Eliza could see some of the men shifting uncomfortably in their saddles, doubt creeping into eyes that had been so certain moments before. Then Carter Mills made a decision. "Enough talk." He raised the rope, the noose swinging obscenely in the morning light. "If Rowan won't do what's right, we'll do it for him. String her up, boys." Several men dismounted and started toward the porch. The shot rang out before Eliza even saw Caleb move. It struck the ground at Carter's horse's feet, sending the animal rearing backward in panic. Carter barely managed to stay in the saddle, his face gone white with shock. "The next one goes through your skull." Caleb's voice was ice. "Anyone who sets foot on my porch dies. Anyone who touches that woman dies. These are facts, gentlemen. I suggest you consider them carefully." The men who had been advancing stopped, looking back at Carter for guidance. But Carter was staring at Caleb's rifle, at the steady hands that held it, at the eyes that held absolutely no doubt or mercy. "You'd hang for this," Carter said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "You'd hang for killing us." "Probably, but you'd still be dead, and so would anyone else who tried to hurt them." Caleb's jaw was set like stone. "I've got nothing left to lose, Mills. Can you say the same?" Another long silence, broken only by the nervous stamping of horses and the harsh breathing of men suddenly aware of their own mortality. "This isn't over," Carter finally said, wheeling his horse around. "You hear me, Rowan? This isn't over. It is for today." Caleb didn't lower his rifle. "Now get off my land before I decide to stop being so reasonable." The riders retreated, their bravado crumbling in the face of a man who had meant every word he said. Eliza watched them go, her whole body shaking with the aftermath of terror and rage. When the last of them had disappeared over the hill, she turned to Caleb and found him still standing exactly as he had been, the rifle still raised, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Caleb." She touched his arm. "They're gone." Slowly, like a man waking from a trance, he lowered the rifle. When he looked at her, his eyes were haunted. "I would have killed them," he said quietly. "If they had touched you, I would have killed every single one of them and not felt a moment's regret." "I know." "That doesn't frighten you?" She took the rifle from his hands and set it aside, then stepped into his arms and held him as tightly as she could. "You would have killed them to protect me," she said against his chest. "That doesn't frighten me. That makes me feel safer than I've felt in my entire life." His arms came around her, crushing her against him, and she felt the tension slowly drain from his body. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the morning light, while somewhere inside the house their children waited for the all-clear that would signal safety. "We need to get married soon," Eliza said finally. "Today, if possible, before they come back with the sheriff or the minister or whatever authority they think will help them. I know a justice of the peace in the next town over. We can be there and back before nightfall." "Then let's go." She pulled back to look at him, her eyes fierce with determination. Let's get married today, and then let them try to tear us apart. Let them try to take this family from me. I will fight them with everything I have, Caleb Rowan, and I will win." He looked at her, this woman who had risen from the ashes of her own destruction, who had faced down a mob with nothing but her voice and her courage, and she saw something like awe in his eyes. "I believe you will," he said. "I believe you will." The wagon rattled down the mountain road toward the next town, carrying a family that had been forged in desperation and tempered by fire. Eliza sat beside Caleb on the bench seat, her hand resting on his thigh in a gesture that still felt new and precious. Behind them, Thomas and Lily huddled together under a blanket, their faces pale but determined, having witnessed more that morning than any children should ever have to see. They had left within the hour, pausing only long enough to pack essentials and explain to the children what was happening. Lily had burst into tears of joy at the news of the wedding, throwing herself at Caleb with such force that she nearly knocked him over. Thomas had been quieter, more reserved, but when Caleb had knelt down to look him in the eye and ask formally for permission to marry his mother, something had shifted in the boy's face. "You'll take care of her?" Thomas had asked, his voice rough. "You promise?" "I promise," Caleb had replied. "And I promise to take care of you and your sister too, for as long as I live." Thomas had considered this for a long moment, then extended his hand like a man sealing a business deal. "Okay then, you can marry her." Eliza had watched the exchange through a blur of tears, seeing in that moment the man her son would become, principled, protective, willing to set aside his own grief for the sake of those he loved. Now, as the miles rolled past beneath them, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. 3 months ago, she had been eating garbage behind a saloon, convinced that death would be a mercy compared to the life she was living. 3 months ago, she had looked at her children's hollow faces and wondered if she had the strength to keep fighting when fighting seemed so pointless. And then a shadow had fallen over them, and everything had changed. "You're quiet," Caleb said, his voice cutting through her reverie. "Having second thoughts?" "No." She squeezed his leg reassuringly. "Just remembering, thinking about how far we've come. We still have far to go. This wedding won't solve everything." "I know, but it's a start." She looked up at him, at the profile she had come to love, the strong jaw, the gray eyes, the lines around his mouth that deepened when he smiled, which he did more often now than when she had first met him. "And I'd rather face what's coming as your wife than as anything else." He glanced down at her, and she saw the warmth in his expression, the love he no longer tried to hide. "I never thought I'd marry again. After Sarah, I couldn't imagine wanting to. But you, Eliza, you've made me want things I thought were dead and buried. Is that good or bad?" "It's terrifying." A small smile curved his lips. "And wonderful, both at the same time." The town of Clear Springs was small but prosperous, built around a silver mine that had brought wealth and relative sophistication to an otherwise unremarkable stretch of Wyoming territory. The justice of the peace, a portly man named Judge Harrison, lived in a neat white house at the edge of town and was known for performing marriages without asking too many questions. He answered the door with flour on his apron and a look of mild surprise on his face. "Caleb Rowan, haven't seen you in, 2 years?" "3," Caleb replied. "I need a favor, Harrison." "A favor, is it?" The judge's eyes moved to Eliza, then to the children standing solemnly behind her. Understanding dawned on his face. "Ah, this kind of favor. If you're willing," Harrison studied them for a long moment, his gaze shrewd but not unkind. "You better come in. My wife just made coffee, and you all look like you could use some." The ceremony took place in the judge's parlor, a cozy room filled with overstuffed furniture and the smell of baking bread. Eliza stood before the fireplace with Caleb's hand warm and steady in hers, feeling as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to leap into something vast and unknown. "Do you, Caleb Rowan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Judge Harrison's voice was formal, but there was a gentleness in his eyes that made Eliza's throat tighten. "I do." Caleb's voice was firm, unwavering. "And do you, Eliza Hart, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" She looked at Caleb, at the man who had pulled her from the gutter, who had given her children a home, who had stood against a mob to protect her. She thought about Daniel, about the love they had shared and the life they had built, and she felt him there somehow, watching, approving, giving her permission to be happy again. "I do," she said, and her voice didn't waver either. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife." Harrison smiled broadly. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Rowan." Caleb drew her close and kissed her, gentle and brief, but full of promise. Behind them, Lily let out a cheer that made everyone laugh, and Thomas clapped with a solemnity that was somehow more moving than any demonstration of joy. They were married. It was done. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The ride home was different than the ride out had been. The tension that had gripped them all morning had loosened, replaced by something lighter, something that felt almost like celebration. Lily chattered constantly about the wedding, about the pretty dress Mrs. Harrison had lent Eliza to wear, about the cake they had been given to take home. Thomas was quieter, but there was a peace in his expression that hadn't been there before. "What do we call you now?" Lily asked Caleb as the wagon crested the last hill before the ranch. "Are you our papa?" Caleb glanced back at her, then at Thomas, his expression careful. "That's up to you. You can call me Caleb or Mr. Rowan or Papa if you want. Whatever feels right." "I want to call you Papa." Lily's voice was decisive. "Is that okay, Mama?" Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. That's okay." "Thomas?" Caleb's voice was gentle. "What about you?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "My papa died. Daniel Hart. He was a good man, and I loved him, and I don't want to forget him." "You won't forget him," Caleb said quietly. "I would never want you to forget him. He was your father, and he always will be. But you're here now. You take care of us. You love Mama." Thomas looked up, and there were tears in his eyes. "Can I call you Pa? It's different from Papa. It would be just for you." Something broke open in Caleb's expression, a wall crumbling, light flooding through. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "Yes, Thomas. You can call me Pa." They reached the ranch as the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that took Eliza's breath away. The house looked the same as when they had left it that morning, but somehow everything was different. It wasn't just Caleb's house anymore. It was their house, their home. "Look," Lily said, pointing toward the road. "Someone's coming." Eliza's heart seized in her chest. After this morning, after Carter Mills and his mob, she couldn't help but fear the worst. But as the approaching figure drew closer, she realized it was just one rider, an older man on a tired horse, his face weathered by sun and time. "That's Sheriff Cooper," Caleb said, his voice carefully neutral. "From Bitter Creek." They waited in the yard as the sheriff approached, Caleb's hand resting on the rifle that was never far from his side. But when Cooper dismounted, his expression was more weary than threatening. "Rowan," he said, nodding. "Mrs. Hart, or I suppose it's Mrs. Rowan now, from what I hear." "News travels fast," Eliza said cautiously. "Judge Harrison sent word. Figured I ought to know before things got more complicated than they already are." Cooper removed his hat and ran a hand through thinning gray hair. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because trouble is coming whether I like it or not, and I'd rather get ahead of it than clean up after it." "What kind of trouble?" Caleb's voice was hard. "Carter Mills filed a complaint this morning. Says you threatened him and his men with a firearm, made death threats, endangered their lives." Cooper held up a hand as Caleb's expression darkened. I know. I've got a pretty good idea what actually happened. Mrs. Patterson came to see me too, told me about the mob, the noose, all of it. But Mills has got money and connections, and he's pushing for formal charges." "On what grounds?" Eliza demanded. "He came onto our property with a lynch mob. We were defending ourselves." "I know that, ma'am, but proving it is another matter. Mills has a dozen men willing to swear they were just coming to express concerns about community standards. Says Rowan opened fire without provocation. That's a lie. Probably. But it's his word against yours, and in this territory, a rich man's word carries a lot of weight. Cooper sighed heavily. I'm trying to help you, Mrs. Rowan. Truly I am. But you need to understand what you're up against. Caleb stepped forward, his jaw set. What do you suggest we do, Sheriff? Honestly, I suggest you find witnesses. People who can testify to Mill's behavior, to the threats he's made, to the way this whole town has treated your wife. If you can show a pattern of harassment, if you can prove that Mills was the aggressor, we might have a chance of making this go away. And if we can't, Cooper met his eyes steadily, then you might be facing a trial. And in this territory, trials don't always go the way they should. After the sheriff left, Eliza sat on the porch and watched the sun sink behind the mountains, her mind racing through possibilities. They had come so far, survived so much, and now the threat of everything being torn away was closer than ever. We'll find witnesses, Caleb said, settling into the chair beside her. There have to be people who've seen how Mills operates, who know what kind of man he really is. Most of them are too afraid to speak up, or they're in his pocket. Not everyone. He reached over and took her hand. Mrs. Patterson stood by you when no one else would. There might be others like her. And if there aren't, then we fight anyway. His grip tightened. I didn't save you from that alley just to lose you to a courtroom, Eliza. Whatever it takes, we'll get through this. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him, but the fear that had been her constant companion for so long was hard to shake, and it whispered in her ear that happiness was temporary, that safety was an illusion, that everything she loved would eventually be taken from her. Then Lily's voice drifted out from inside the house, singing some nonsense song she had made up, and Thomas's laughter followed, the first time Eliza had heard him laugh, really laugh, in months. She looked at Caleb, at this man who had become her husband, her partner, her home. Whatever it takes, she agreed, together. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of joy and dread. Life on the ranch continued in its familiar rhythms, meals prepared, animals tended, children taught and loved and nurtured. But beneath it all ran a current of anxiety, a knowledge that the sword hanging over their heads could fall at any moment. Mrs. Patterson proved to be an invaluable ally. She came to the ranch twice a week, bringing supplies and news and, most importantly, names. Names of people who had been wronged by Carter Mills. Names of women he had harassed, men he had cheated, families he had driven off their land through intimidation and fraud. There's more than you'd think, she told Eliza over tea one afternoon. People are afraid to speak up individually, but if enough of them come forward together, would they? Come forward, I mean? Some might, if they knew they weren't alone. If they believed there was a chance of actually holding Mills accountable. Eliza began making visits of her own, traveling with Caleb to remote homesteads and small farms scattered across the valley. She listened to stories of bullying and threats, of loans called in without warning, of livestock mysteriously dying, and fences mysteriously burning. She saw the fear in people's eyes, the resignation of those who had accepted that Carter Mills was simply a force of nature, as inevitable and uncontrollable as the weather. But she also saw something else in some of those eyes, a spark of hope, of possibility, of the same stubborn refusal to surrender that had kept her going through the darkest days of her own journey. We could fight him, a farmer named Henry Wilkins said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. If we all stood together, we could fight him. Would you? Caleb asked. Would you stand up in a courtroom and tell the truth about what he's done? Henry looked at his wife, at his children playing in the next room, at the modest home he had built with his own hands. Yes, he said finally. Yes, I think I would. If it meant my kids could grow up in a town where men like Carter Mills don't get to do whatever they want. By the time the trial date arrived, Eliza had gathered statements from 17 people willing to testify against Carter Mills. 17 families who had been waiting, some of them for years, for someone to stand up and say that enough was enough. The trial was held in the Bitter Creek Courthouse, a modest building that had never seen so many spectators crammed into its wooden benches. The entire town seemed to have turned out, drawn by curiosity or outrage or the simple human desire to witness conflict. Eliza sat in the front row with Thomas and Lily on either side of her, their small hands gripping hers tightly. Caleb sat at the defendant's table, his face calm but his eyes sharp, watching everything with the focused attention of a man who had too much to lose. The prosecutor, a young man named Adams, who had clearly been expecting an easy conviction, began confidently enough. He called Carter Mills to the stand, where the rancher told a tale of innocent men threatened by a madman with a rifle, of a woman of questionable virtue corrupting a once respectable household, of concerned citizens simply trying to protect their community. It was a good story, smooth and rehearsed. The jury, 12 men from Bitter Creek and the surrounding area, listened with the solemn attention of people who believed what they were hearing. Then the defense attorney stood up. He was an older man named Blackwood, hired by Caleb at considerable expense, with a reputation for taking on cases that others considered hopeless. He approached Carter Mills with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Mills, you've testified that you came to the Rowan Ranch out of concern for community standards. Is that correct?" "That's right. And you brought a dozen armed men with you because, for protection, Rowan has a violent reputation." "I see. And the rope? The noose that several witnesses saw you carrying, was that also for protection?" Carter's face reddened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No? Perhaps this will refresh your memory." Blackwood held up a coil of rope, the noose still tied at one end. "This was found on your property yesterday, Mr. Mills. The knot is quite distinctive, wouldn't you say?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge banged his gavel for silence, but Eliza could see the damage had been done. Several jurors were staring at the rope with expressions of horror. From there, the trial became a cascade of revelations. One by one, Blackwood called his witnesses, farmers and shopkeepers, mothers and fathers, ordinary people who had suffered under Carter Mills' tyranny for years. They told their stories with voices that shook, but never wavered. And with each testimony, the picture of Mills as a concerned citizen crumbled a little more. Henry Wilkins described how Mills had poisoned his cattle after he refused to sell his land. A woman named Sarah Jenkins told how Mills had threatened her children when her husband tried to run against him for the county council. A former employee revealed that Mills kept records of bribes paid to local officials, records that Blackwood produced with a flourish that made the prosecutor turn pale. But it was Mrs. Patterson who delivered the most damaging testimony of all. "I've lived in this town for 40 years, she said, her voice steady despite her age. "I've watched Carter Mills destroy anyone who stood in his way. I've watched good people driven from their homes, families torn apart, lives ruined, and I've stayed silent because I was afraid." She paused, her eyes moving to Eliza. But then I watched a young widow and her children starving in our streets, and I watched this town turn its back on them because Carter Mills made it clear that anyone who helped them would suffer, and I realized that my silence made me complicit in their suffering. "Mrs. Patterson," Blackwood said gently, "can you tell the court what you witnessed on the morning of October 15th? "I can. I was at the Rowan Ranch delivering supplies when Carter Mills arrived with his mob. I saw the rope. I heard the threats. I watched him promise to hang Mrs. Rowan, Mrs. Hart, as she was then, while his men cheered." Her voice hardened. "And I watched Caleb Rowan stand between that woman and a lynching with nothing but his rifle and his courage." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. "That man," Mrs. Patterson continued, pointing at Caleb, "didn't threaten anyone. He defended his home and his family against murderers. If that's a crime in this territory, then I despair for all of us." The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned with a verdict of not guilty for Caleb and recommended charges against Carter Mills for attempted murder, conspiracy, and a dozen other offenses, the courtroom exploded into chaos. Some people cheered, others shouted in outrage, but Eliza heard none of it. She was too busy fighting her way through the crowd to reach her husband, throwing herself into his arms with a sob of relief that she couldn't contain. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "It's finally over." "Not quite," he murmured into her hair. "But the hardest part is done." She pulled back to look at him, at the face she had come to love more than she had ever thought possible. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we still have a life to build, a home to make, children to raise." He smiled, and it transformed his face, the grief that had haunted him for so long finally beginning to fade. "I mean, we have a future now, Eliza. a real future, and I intend to make the most of it. The months that followed brought changes that Eliza could never have predicted. Carter Mills was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. His ranch was seized to pay restitution to his victims, and the land was divided among the families he had wronged. Henry Wilkins bought a parcel that doubled his holdings. Sarah Jenkins used her share to open a dress shop in town. The balance of power in Bitter Creek shifted, slowly but unmistakably, towards something more just. The Women's Society disbanded after Mrs. Henderson moved away in disgrace, her husband's involvement in Mills schemes having been exposed during the trial. A new group formed in its place, one that focused on actually helping those in need rather than judging them. Eliza was invited to join, and after some hesitation, she accepted. It felt like a victory, small but significant. The ranch prospered under Caleb's careful management and Eliza's tireless work. They expanded the herd, repaired the outbuildings, planted an orchard that would take years to bear fruit, but represented hope for the future. Thomas proved to have a natural gift with horses, and Caleb began teaching him the business of ranching with a patience and dedication that made Eliza's heart swell every time she watched them together. And on a warm spring morning, exactly 1 year after Eliza had crouched behind the saloon, eating garbage with her children, she stood in the meadow behind the house and watched Caleb plant a rosebush beside the graves of Sarah and Benjamin. "I want them to know," he said quietly, his hands gentle in the soil. "I want them to know that I found happiness again, that I didn't give up." "They know," Eliza said, kneeling beside him. "Wherever they are, they know." He looked at her, and she saw tears on his cheeks, the first time she had ever seen him cry. "I love them so much, I still do." "I know. And I love you for that, the way you love them. It's part of what makes you who you are." She took his hand, dirt and all. "They're part of our family now too, Caleb. Part of the story we're building together." He nodded slowly, accepting her words, accepting the complicated truth that love didn't diminish when it was shared. It multiplied. That grief and joy could coexist, that the past and the future could be held in the same heart without either one diminishing the other. "I want to show you something," he said, rising and pulling her to her feet. "I've been working on it for weeks, but I wanted to wait until today." He led her to the house, up the stairs, down the hallway, to the door she had never opened since that first day when she had glimpsed the nursery and understood his loss. "Caleb," she said, her voice uncertain, "you don't have to." "I want to." He opened the door. The room had been transformed. The faded yellow walls had been repainted a soft green. The dusty furniture had been cleaned and rearranged. The cradle was gone, replaced by a small desk and chair. The rag doll still sat on the bed, but it had been joined by new toys, a wooden horse, a set of blocks, a picture book with bright illustrations. "For Lily," Caleb said quietly. "If she wants it. She's getting too old to share a room with Thomas. I thought she might like a space of her own." Eliza looked at the room, at the love and care that had gone into every detail, and felt her heart overflow. "You kept the doll." "Sarah made it for Benjamin before he was born. It seemed wrong to put it away, but I thought maybe Lily could take care of it now, give it a new home. She'll love it." Eliza turned to face him, cupping his face in her hands. "She'll love it because it came from you, because you thought of her, because you've become her father in every way that matters." He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. "I never thought I'd be a father again. Never thought I'd want to be. But you are. You're Thomas's pa and Lily's papa, and you're going to be—" She stopped, suddenly uncertain. His eyes opened. "Going to be what?" She took a deep breath. She had been waiting for the right moment to tell him, but somehow this moment, standing in this room that represented so much pain transformed into hope, felt perfect. "You're going to be a father again," she said softly. "In about 7 months, if my calculations are correct." Caleb stared at her. For a long moment he didn't speak, didn't move, didn't seem to breathe. Then his face crumpled, and he pulled her into an embrace so tight she could barely breathe. "Are you sure?" His voice was muffled against her hair. "I'm sure. I've been sure for weeks, but I wanted to wait until I was certain, until—" He kissed her, cutting off her words, and she felt the joy and terror and overwhelming love that was coursing through him. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were shining. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby. Our baby. Yours and mine." She smiled through her own tears. A new beginning. They stood together in the transformed nursery, holding each other as the spring sunlight streamed through the window. Outside, she could hear Thomas calling to Lily about something, hear the chickens clucking in their coop, hear the sounds of the life they had built together against all odds. Eliza thought about the journey that had brought her here, the loss, the desperation, the moment when a stranger's shadow had fallen across her shame and changed everything. She thought about hunger and fear and the cold cruelty of people who should have helped her. She thought about courage and kindness and the unexpected grace of second chances. And she thought about what Caleb had said to her so long ago, on that first day when he had pulled her from the gutter and offered her something she had never dared to hope for. Sometimes, the greatest turning point in a life isn't a miracle or a battle. It's just a steady voice that says, "You belong here." She belonged here now, in this house with this man, surrounded by children who called her mama, and a future that stretched before them, full of possibility. "I love you," she said to Caleb, the words simple but containing everything. "I love you too," he replied, "more than I ever thought I could love anything again." They walked downstairs together, hand in hand, to tell the children about the baby, to continue building the life they had chosen, to keep writing the story that had begun in desperation and was now, finally, finding its way towards something that looked remarkably like joy. The ranch stretched around them, solid and welcoming, a home built from hard work and healing and the stubborn refusal to give up. The mountains rose in the distance, ancient and unchanging, witnesses to generations of struggle and triumph. And somewhere, in the small cemetery behind the house where wildflowers were beginning to bloom around two modest headstones, the rosebush Caleb had planted that morning was putting down roots. New life growing from old grief, hope rising from ashes, a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice, by love, by the simple, profound decision to stay.